On a cold, gray morning in Newark, Marcus Harris, a single father in his early 30s, stood outside a small corner store with his hand firmly clutching his wallet. It was a cracked, old wallet, worn thin from years of use. Inside, there were only a few crumpled bills and some loose change, barely enough to buy the most basic necessities. As he made his way toward his aging pickup truck, the weight of his responsibilities pressed heavily on his chest. His eyes drifted to the curb near the entrance, where a young girl sat alone, sobbing softly into her hands. Her small figure trembled in the chill of the morning air, and the delicate pink coat she wore seemed out of place in this part of town. To clean. Marcus hesitated. He had his own problems. A pile of overdue bills sat on his cluttered kitchen table, and his truck was barely holding together after weeks of wear and tear. His mind constantly raced with worries about his young daughter, Ella, and the uncertain future that loomed over them. He had only enough cash for some milk, a loaf of bread, and maybe a jar of peanut butter. If he didn't make it to work soon, there wouldn't be any money at all. The thought of risking even more trouble was terrifying. But when the girl looked up, her tear-streaked face filled with fear, something shifted inside him. For a moment, Marcus thought of Ella, his bright-eyed little girl, who deserved so much more than what he could give her. He couldn't just walk away. With a sigh, Marcus changed direction, his boots scuffing against the pavement as he approached the girl, knowing that no matter what, this was the right thing to do. Despite the weight of his burdens, Marcus Harris found solace in his small apartment, where every corner seemed to echo with memories of better times. The sun had barely risen, and the pale light filtered through the cracked blinds, casting long shadows across the room. The smell of stale leather and motor oil still lingered in the air, remnants of his days as a mechanic, a time when he had felt like a man with purpose. But now, those days felt distant, just a memory of a life that had slipped away, like sand through his fingers. Marcus sat at the edge of his couch, his elbows resting on his knees as his head hung low in his hands. He thought of his daughter, Ella, and the life he had promised her. At just 7 years old, she had never once complained about their situation. Even in their worn-out apartment, with its peeling wallpaper and flickering lights, she always found a way to smile. She made the best of things, even when there was little to make the best of. That morning, as he spread a thin layer of peanut butter over a slice of bread for Ella's breakfast, he caught himself holding his breath. The fridge, nearly empty save for a carton of milk and a jar of peanut butter, barely offered enough to get by. But it was all they had, and somehow Marcus made it work. His heart ached as he placed the toast in front of Ella, watching her carefully take a bite. She looked up at him with those wide, trusting eyes, and he forced a smile, trying to hide the fear gnawing at him. "Thanks, Dad," she said softly, her voice carrying the quiet optimism he had come to rely on. He wanted so badly to promise her everything: better days, a house with a yard, the life they deserved. But words felt like hollow promises in the face of the cold reality surrounding them. Still, he smiled, because Ella needed to believe that things would get better. And for her sake, he had to believe it too. As Marcus walked out of the grocery store, the cold air slapped his face, making him pull his coat tighter around his shoulders. The sun was starting to break through the gray clouds, casting a sharp, bright light over the nearly empty parking lot. He glanced at the plastic bag in his hand: milk, bread, peanut butter, barely enough to make it through the next few days, but it would have to do. The bills, the truck, the looming threat of eviction. His mind was a whirlwind of worries, but he forced himself to focus on the task at hand: get to the truck, go home, and try to make it another day. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw her. A little girl, no more than 6, sitting alone on the curb near the store entrance. Her small body shook with quiet sobs, and her blonde hair, neatly tied into pigtails, bounced gently with each breath she took. Marcus's first instinct was to keep walking. She was just another lost kid, right? Someone's daughter would come along soon, frantic but relieved to find her. He had his own problems, after all. But as he walked closer, the sight of her trembling, wide-eyed stare stopped him in his tracks. His heart lurched. What if it were Ella sitting there, alone, scared, and helpless? He couldn't just walk away. With a deep breath, Marcus changed direction, his boots crunching on the cold pavement as he made his way over. He crouched down beside her, trying to keep his voice as calm as possible. "Hey, sweetheart, are you okay?" The girl flinched at first, her little body shrinking into itself, but then she slowly looked up at him. Marcus saw the fear in her eyes, the kind of fear that made him ache in ways he hadn't expected. She was terrified, not just of being lost, but of him. He smiled gently, trying to reassure her. "I'm not gonna hurt you, okay? Just trying to help." Her lip trembled, and she nodded hesitantly. He sat down beside her, keeping a safe distance, knowing that this was one of those moments where a small act of kindness could change everything. Marcus gently eased himself onto the bench beside the little girl, who was still sniffing and wiping at her tear-streaked face. He didn't sit too close, just far enough to give her space, but close enough to show that he wasn't going anywhere. "What's your name?" he asked, trying to keep his voice as soft as possible, hoping it would make her feel a little less scared. The girl hesitated, looking up at him through her messy blonde curls. She seemed to be weighing him with those big, glassy eyes, as if trying to decide if he was friend or foe. Finally, she whispered, "Emily." "All right, Emily, you're lost, huh?" She nodded, her little chin trembling. "I can't find my mommy." Marcus's heart tightened, but he pushed the feeling down. He had been on the receiving end of plenty of looks that said you don't belong here, especially in this part of town. People would clutch their bags a little tighter when he passed by, and store clerks would eye him with suspicion. And now, this little girl was doing the same thing, but he didn't blame her. Kids were taught to be careful with strangers, especially men who didn't look like the ones who usually helped out. "Don't worry, Emily," Marcus said, forcing a smile as he pulled out his phone. "We'll figure this out. You just hang tight, okay?" She nodded slowly, still looking up at him like he was some kind of mystery. "Do you know your mom's phone number?" he asked, hoping that she had it written down somewhere. Emily pulled out a crumpled piece of paper from her little pink backpack and handed it over with a shaky hand. Marcus took it, smoothing out the creases and dialing the number on the paper. It rang, once, twice, no answer. "Well, we're not getting anywhere with that," Marcus muttered to himself. Emily's wide eyes watched him, and he couldn't help but wonder if she was expecting him to give up and walk away. But that wasn't happening. "Okay," he said after a long pause, his voice steady but kind. "Let's try something else. We're going to get you home, all right?" She blinked, clearly unsure, but then her lips parted and she whispered, "Okay." Marcus took a deep breath. Maybe it was his instinct, maybe it was just the right thing to do, but he wasn't about to leave this girl sitting alone, lost in a world that didn't always make sense. He knew he was going to have to make this work. As Marcus drove down the street, the engine of his old truck rattling and sputtering with each bump in the road, he couldn't help but feel a bit like a fish out of water. The neighborhood they were headed toward felt like a different world. The streets were lined with trees that seemed to have been perfectly trimmed, and the lawns were so green and well-kept they could have been plucked straight from a home improvement magazine. It was as if he had crossed an invisible line from one side of the city to another, where everything looked pristine and untouched. He glanced in the rearview mirror at Emily, who was now sitting quietly in the passenger seat, her tiny hands gripping her backpack like it was her lifeline. She had stopped crying, but the look of uncertainty in her eyes hadn't gone away. "Are you sure you're okay?" Marcus asked, trying to lighten the mood. "I promise, we're almost there. You'll be back with your mom in no time." Emily nodded, her eyes flicking from the window to him, and then back outside as the truck rumbled along. She didn't say much, but the way her small form seemed to relax a little made Marcus feel like maybe, just maybe, he was doing the right thing. The next few minutes felt like an eternity, the truck bouncing over the smooth streets as Marcus tried to think of something to say that wouldn't make him sound like a stranger giving a long-winded speech. But nothing came to mind. He'd always been better at fixing cars than talking to kids, and this situation wasn't exactly one for small talk. As they pulled up in front of a tall, two-story house with white shutters and a neat stone walkway, Emily's eyes widened. The house looked like it belonged in a storybook, a stark contrast to the world Marcus knew. "Here we are," he said, his voice surprisingly soft. Before he could even park the truck, the front door of the house flew open. A woman probably in her late 30s, with dark hair and an expensive-looking coat came rushing down the steps, arms flung open. "Emily," she called, her voice choked with relief. Emily jumped out of the truck before Marcus had even parked, stumbling a bit as she ran toward the woman. "Mom," she cried, throwing herself into the woman's arms. Marcus stayed in the truck for a moment, watching the reunion, feeling a lump form in his throat. As much as it had stung to see the fear in Emily's eyes earlier, the joy on her mother's face made it all worth it. He wasn't just the guy who helped a lost child get home. He was part of something bigger, something that made a difference. The woman Emily's mother pulled away from the hug, her hands still holding Emily's shoulders as she looked up at Marcus with a mixture of gratitude and wariness. She hesitated, as if unsure of how to thank him, before finally saying, "Thank you. I don't know what I would have done without you." Marcus offered a small, tight-lipped smile. "No problem," he said, nodding toward Emily. "She's a brave little girl." With that, he turned and walked back to his truck, feeling the weight of the moment linger. This was one of those times when you didn't need a reward to feel like you'd done something good. And as he drove away, the cold air didn't feel so heavy anymore. Later that afternoon, Marcus was back in his truck, heading home after the long, exhausting ordeal of helping Emily. His mind still lingered on the look of relief on the woman's face when her daughter was safely back in her arms. He had done the right thing, sure, but it wasn't like he expected anything more than a simple thank you. People didn't just hand out rewards for doing what was decent. That wasn't how the world worked. But then, as he pulled into the parking lot near his rundown apartment, something caught his eye. A sleek, black car had just rolled into the lot, its polished exterior gleaming in the late afternoon sun, looking completely out of place among the tired sedans and old trucks parked nearby. Marcus barely spared it a glance until the driver's door opened and a tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out. The guy was dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than Marcus's rent for a month. Marcus tensed, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. He watched as the man walked toward him with slow, confident strides, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. "Mr. Harris," the man asked smoothly, his voice almost too smooth, like he was used to making deals. "I'm Gregory Bennett. My wife told me what you did for my daughter." Marcus blinked, caught off guard. Yeah," he muttered, not sure how to respond. The guy wasn't exactly the kind of person Marcus usually interacted with, rich, well-dressed, the kind of person who probably didn't even know what it was like to worry about bills or broken-down trucks. Gregory extended a hand, but Marcus didn't take it. Instead, he stared at the man's outstretched fingers before his gaze flicked back to the black car, then back at Gregory. "Your wife already thanked me," Marcus said, his voice tight. "Don't need anything else." Gregory chuckled, unfazed. "I'm sure she did. But I wanted to do more than just say thank you." He paused, like he was waiting for Marcus to bite. "I wanted to offer you a job." "A job?" Marcus echoed, his mind racing. "You're offering me a job because I helped your kid?" Gregory nodded, his expression unreadable. "Not just because of that. I saw something in you, Marcus. You didn't hesitate when Emily needed help. You did the right thing, no questions asked. That's the kind of person we need." Marcus stood there, momentarily stunned. This wasn't some charity offer. This wasn't some pity handout. This was a real offer, something that could change everything. Gregory smiled, almost like he knew he had Marcus right where he wanted him. "Think about it," he said, pulling out a business card and handing it over. "Give me a call if you're interested." As Gregory walked back to his car, Marcus stood frozen in place, the card still heavy in his hand. For the first time in what felt like forever, the weight in his chest felt lighter. Maybe things were finally starting to turn around. Marcus couldn't believe what he was holding in his hand. The glossy business card felt heavier than it had any right to. The embossed letters of Gregory Bennett's name seemed to burn through the paper, leaving an impression that would stick in his mind for days. He couldn't help but wonder, was this for real? Was this just some rich guy's way of making himself feel good for doing the right thing? Or was this his shot at something better? He stared at the card for a long moment, still parked in his truck. The sun had almost set, and the once bright parking lot had turned a murky shade of gray. The sounds of the city seemed to fade into the background as Marcus let the weight of the situation settle in. Gregory Bennett, some high-powered businessman, was offering him a job, a real job. The kind where you didn't have to worry about whether you could make rent or if your truck was going to break down halfway through a job. But it wasn't just about the job, was it? It was about the chance to do something different, something that would change everything for him and his daughter. No more scraping by, no more just getting by day to day. A steady paycheck, stability, the kind of life Marcus had promised to give Ella, the kind of life he had always hoped for but never thought he'd actually get. "Come on, Marcus," he muttered to himself, his hand tightening around the card. "What's the worst that could happen?" With a deep breath, he started the truck, the engine coughing and sputtering to life. As he pulled out of the parking lot, he felt a strange sense of purpose, like he was actually moving forward for the first time in years. Maybe, just maybe, this job was the beginning of everything changing. And if it wasn't, well, he had nothing to lose. He had already survived worse. He was going to call Bennett. And whatever came next, he was ready for it. The first few days at the construction site were nothing short of brutal. Marcus had worked manual labor jobs before hauling boxes, unloading trucks, but this was different. The hours stretched long into the day, with the sun beating down like it had a vendetta against him. His muscles ached in places he didn't even know he had muscles. By the end of the first day, his hands were raw, his back sore, and his body felt like it had been put through a meat grinder. But Marcus wasn't one to complain. Not anymore. He had too much riding on this. His daughter, Ella, was counting on him, and he wasn't going to let her down. So he put his head down and got to work, hauling cement bags, driving nails into wooden beams, and doing whatever else Hank, the gruff foreman, asked of him. The older workers eyed him with skepticism, their faces crinkling in doubt every time he picked up a shovel or grabbed a tool. They probably thought he'd quit after a few days, but Marcus wasn't going anywhere. Not this time. Hank, though, was a different story. The man had an air of authority about him, his arms crossed over his chest as he barked orders, watching every move Marcus made. There was no praise, no kind words, just a steady, unwavering eye on the new guy, waiting to see if he would crack under pressure. But Marcus didn't crack, not even close. Every morning, he showed up earlier than anyone else, and he worked until the job was done. Slowly, the other workers started to take notice. Hank would toss him a bottle of water here and there, but it wasn't a compliment, it was just a subtle acknowledgement. "You're doing okay," Hank muttered one day, though it was hard to tell if he actually meant it. Marcus wasn't expecting anything more. He wasn't there for the praise. He was there for the future. And as the days went on, something inside him began to shift. Maybe this job was the start of something new. Maybe, just maybe, he was finally building a life that wouldn't fall apart the moment he looked away. Weeks passed, and Marcus found his rhythm on the job. His hands, though still calloused and sore, were now more accustomed to the heavy lifting and relentless hours. The work wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. And for the first time in a long time, Marcus wasn't just surviving, he was moving forward. There was something about the consistency, the routine, that gave him a sense of pride. He was proving to himself and to the world that he was capable of more than just scraping by. One evening, after a long day of labor, Gregory Bennett approached him on the construction site. The sun was beginning to dip behind the horizon, painting the sky with shades of pink and orange. The cool evening breeze brushed against Marcus's face as Gregory stopped in front of him, a slight smile playing on his lips. "You've been doing good work, Marcus," Gregory said, his tone measured but appreciative. "I think you've got potential." Marcus wasn't sure if he'd heard that correctly. Potential? Him? All he'd ever known was hard work and getting by day. But here was Gregory, a man whose life seemed worlds apart from his own, telling him that he had potential. "I've been keeping an eye on you," Gregory continued, "and I think you've got what it takes to move up. There's a management training program starting soon. I think you should give it a shot." Marcus stood there for a moment, processing the offer. It wasn't just a job anymore, it was a chance to lead, to break free from the grind, and to build something that could last. As he stood there, feeling the weight of Gregory's words settle in, Marcus realized something important. Sometimes, the hardest part of success isn't the work itself, but having the courage to believe that you deserve it. He had spent so long doubting himself, never daring to dream bigger. But now, with the possibility of a future in front of him, Marcus knew that it was time to stop just surviving and start living. With a steady breath, he nodded, "I'm in." And just like that, his life was beginning to change in ways he hadn't imagined. That evening, as Marcus sat down at the small kitchen table in his apartment, a strange sense of peace settled over him. His daughter, Ella, had already gone to bed, her soft breathing filling the silence of the room. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the crumpled business card Gregory Bennett had given him. He had called Gregory earlier that day and accepted the offer. A job, a real job that could change everything. He wasn't sure what he had expected, but hearing the words management training still felt surreal. Ella's drawing from earlier that day was still sitting on the table, an ambitious picture of a house with a backyard, a swing, and a big dog right in the middle. It had been her dream, a simple dream, the kind of dream that most children had. And for the first time in a long while, Marcus allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, that dream wasn't out of reach. He rubbed his hand over his face, thinking back to everything that had led him here. His life had been a series of setbacks: losing his job, struggling to make ends meet, questioning whether he was ever going to get ahead. But today, something was different. Today, he had taken a chance on himself. The road hadn't been easy, and it wasn't going to be. But Marcus understood now that the key wasn't just in hard work. It was in having the courage to take opportunities when they came, no matter how unexpected or intimidating they seemed. Looking down at Ella's drawing, Marcus smiled. "One day, kid," he whispered, "one day." For the first time in a long time, he wasn't just hoping for change. He was making it happen, and that, he realized, was the lesson. Dreams might seem far away, but with every small step, they came closer. All he had to do was keep moving forward.